multiple people want is to be able to spin up by batteries. That's your app. And that is hard. Most of the time, today is so can I
It's reasonable performance. Yeah, 10:01. That's just.
All right, folks. It's time to get going. This is Gnap at IETF 114. Welcome. So we have basically a big status update and walkthrough of issues today. So we're gonna get to the meat here, but let's just sort of quickly remind everybody about the Note well and about the IETF Code of Conduct, which we actually didn't put on the slide, but you've seen it many times this week, so you know what it is. And also, it does involve masking up, which I will now demonstrate. Here we go. In meetings. So unless you're a presenter, and then you can do as you please. The microphones work reasonably well with most, so it really doesn't matter that much. All right, what are we doing next? It would be great if we can get somebody to keep an eye on Zulip or on the chat room. As you know, Zulip is mirrored into the MeetEcho chat room. If somebody could keep an eye on it and see if something needs channeling, but we do need a minute taker, preferably to work directly into the minute taking tool. So do we have any volunteers? Volunteers for minute taking? Yes, no, yes, no. Volunteers for minute taking? Nobody feels, well, I mean, I think we can, worst case, we can deal with that, I think, because there isn't all that much probably to minute this time around. So, so we have the editing team. Justin is remote. He did say that, well, he is actually here. So I'm going to turn it over to Justin and Aaron. I think Aaron is going to be the one standing up front here and walking us through what's happened with the core document since last time. And there's Justin in full color. And then let's just flip the slides. Where do I request control? Yeah. So if you we're just getting the slide up. Give me a second. All right. I think if I do this, oh, wait, you got it, right?
No, nothing changed.
Right. Try to,
Let's try.
yeah. If you if you hover on arrow on that list, if you hover on that, I think you go to that thing, the one on the right. There you go.
Okay.
Now you should have it. All right.
Got some buttons.
Okay. The mechanics of slide sharing sorted.
Okay. Yes, I'm Aaron Brecke. Going to go through some of the slides here, and I think Justin's going to cover for me for some parts of it as well. And I'm going to give you an update. Sorry?
Now you have it.
Now I have it?
Yeah.
Yes, it works. The rough agenda for the session is we have some updates to share about the various, the 2 documents that are part of the group right now. And I'm going to go over some of the changes, what they mean, share kind of details on what's happened with that, and then also talk about some of the stuff that we are planning in the future. And I think we've identified a couple issues that maybe we can talk about here as well. So the full dip links are on the slides. They're clickable if you are on the PDF from the meeting materials. And we're going to go over the changes here. So there's 2 drafts. There's the core protocol that talks about client to authorization server communication. And there's the second draft is the resource server draft that talks about resource servers validating requests coming in and what they need to do to deal with that. Most of the work that has been done has been on the core document. Still, there's been only some minor changes to the resource server draft, so that's the big to-do item in the future. We've been working on GitHub, so if you want to see the details of all of the changes, they're very, very meticulously documented on GitHub, which I appreciate. And you can go find the pull requests that have been merged along with the discussions that have happened there. And we've been trying to do a good job of making sure every change goes into a PR that gets tagged and tagged properly. And now you can see them all by clicking these links. The changes that we've done on the core document have closed 40 of the open issues, which is a very good number. I think that's one of the largest numbers we've been able to deal with between meetings. So that's great, a lot of good progress there. And then unfortunately, none of the issues on the resource server draft have been closed from the changes. So it was just other things that were changed. So the changes, we've grouped them into editorial versus actual functional changes. So all of these are links to issues on GitHub. Again, if you're curious about the actual text behind these changes in the draft. So there's text consistency just means that we found some inconsistencies with the text in the spec, which have been corrected. So they are now better describe what they're talking about. And editorial is things that don't have any functional changes, but are otherwise maybe more significant changes. And that release number 10 is just the mechanics of doing the release. So I think we're going to go into some of these in detail. Yeah. We now have fancy diagrams in SVG, which is the new way to do diagrams in these RFCs, since we have the ability to publish SVG now. One of the cool things about this is it's actually generated from the ASCII art source. So kind of cool, which also means it has a nice fallback to if this is represented in ASCII. There's been some changes on the idea of future proofing for new Jose signature methods. And that was, again, we're not trying to lock it down to the current snapshot. So we want to make sure that it is future proof. And when new mechanisms come in, they are usable here. There's some changes around the rights for APIs of what it means when the client is asking for access to a thing, about whether that's a string or an object, and some discussion on resource owner policies, which I think addressed a couple of issues simultaneously. There's also a new paper from Florian with a very detailed 125 pages of security analysis of the protocol. That was a thesis paper, so congratulations on publishing that, and thank you for doing that also. And there's now an acknowledgement in the spec that mentions that as well. The TLDR, I guess, is that there's mitigations for many of the security issues that were identified have been mentioned in the spec already, which is good. But there will need to be more analysis done if Gnap is ever used as an identity protocol. So that is, yeah, thanks for doing that. It's a lot of reading, I'm sure, and a lot of writing. Okay, on to the more functional changes, things that actually change behaviors of any implementations. There is so 415 is I think the only security related thing that describes this idea of a session attack and a consideration for it. A couple of the syntax changes are really nitpicky things about just like, it would be nicer if we didn't have such a verbose object structure for such and such. There is one feature that has been dropped, and this is kind of been a theme, is been removing things that haven't had a lot of interest expressed in it. There was a lot of things in the core spec, I guess, or at least in the mentions of possibilities that have been, we've been whittling them down to remove them because there hasn't been interest in those features. And if there isn't interest, then there's not going to be anybody to write the text for it, which means it's not really going to be a feature. And then there's, on the protocol flow side, there's a new state diagram, which is trying to describe how we expect the state of the entire system to change over time, who's talking to what, and there's some discussion around that. And there's now actually a new change that allows interactions to timeout, which basically means that if it's explicitly mentioned that we're not expecting like the AS to hold on to things forever. So again, those are all linked if you want to see the actual details. This is an example of one of the syntax changes where it was just kind of a holdover from some previous syntax that I think it had more options in it before. And by removing some of these options, now the syntax is kind of redundant, so it just uses a string for that user code. This is the thing that like the user would type in, they would see it on a TV screen, type this in. So again, minor change, but it is technically a breaking change.
Right. Just on that last one, I want to note that that syntax change is there's now user code URL and user code as two separate modes, whereas before they were one thing, and it was confusing because sometimes you could do one and sometimes the other, and it wasn't clear on what a client would actually need to expect at any point. So this goes with what Aaron was saying before of like, you know, looking at what people actually want to do with this and whittling it down to be as simple as the mechanism can be. And so this was the syntax for this mode catching up with what was actually in it, because it doesn't make sense to have an object that only always has a single value inside this protocol.
Yeah, and I think that is a theme that you'll see with a lot of these changes, is that we're trying to make it so that a client developer it kind of knows what to expect by the data that's coming back, and they don't have to go and look it up necessarily because it's kind of just obvious what it does. So hopefully this helps. This is that split token feature that sort of previously existed that we have now dropped. The idea was a request for a token might return actually multiple tokens, which the idea was if you have multiple APIs, multiple resource servers, and you wanted them to be able to not have to validate the same looking token. If you want actually different tokens targeted different resource servers, you could get them all in one request. It sounds like a cool feature. I agree it's a cool feature. Apparently nobody was interested, and it also complicates things quite a bit. So if there isn't demand for it, it makes sense to drop it. Otherwise, it's going to be only half baked in the spec, which is probably worse. Actually, it's definitely worse. So,
and this particular feature, there's discussed, this is a really reasonable thing to target as sort of an advanced extension. So somebody who needs this inside their particular ecosystem that wants to actually build this out and get experience with what this looks like, especially with the additional complexity on the client side of, like, I only asked for 1 token, but you gave me back 3 because you've got 3 different RS domains that you're dealing with. A client's going to need to know what to do with that. And there's a lot of unanswered questions there that this function was raising that, you know, implementation experience would help answer there. So this could come back as an extension someday, but it was not a good candidate to keep in core.
Yep, thanks. Okay, key proofs. So in the previous version, there was a, this is how the client is telling the AS what it's going to be using as a proof. Is that, did I get that right? Yeah. You used to have just this string, which is essentially internal description of what that is between at the AS. The new mode actually gives it the ability to have all these different attributes of that method because HTTP signatures can use different algorithms and different signatures and different digest algorithms. So HTTP signatures by itself is not enough to actually describe what we actually mean. So there's now an expanded version of this that describes the exact bits that are required. This one is a fun one that actually I need to go file an issue on one of the OAuth specs for this as well. The hash algorithm names, there's been this convention of using abbreviations for them or shortened versions of the names. And there is an actual registry that describes exactly like the short string to the actual method. And a lot of specs haven't been using it. And they've just been sort of crossing your fingers that people are going to figure it out. So we did a big pass through this spec and updated the algorithm names to actually properly reference the IANA registry for the algorithms explicitly. And that is much better than just sort of leaving it up to everybody to figure out what we meant by SHA-2. So that is technically a breaking change because if anybody had written code that recognizes the string SHA-2, they now have to update it to recognize SHA-2 512 or send that. Okay, this is for you, Justin, right?
Yeah. All right. So I don't think I have slide controls on my end, so I'll just ask for next slide as we go through this. All right. So what we realized a while ago, there was an issue filed for this quite some time ago, is that there is sort of an implied life cycle when you're making one of these requests for access, whether it's to an API or user information or whatever. There's this life cycle that everything goes through, and that it, you know, you kind of, this exists in OAuth as well, but it's never really talked about in OAuth space until people started defining the grant management API over in the FAPI working group. Then it starts to kind of come to the fore that there are these underlying sort of grant request objects that go through different states in the protocol. So what we decided to do in Gnap is call that out explicitly. So next slide. We put together, this is, we mentioned this at the last IETF meeting in Vienna. This is what we've come up with for the state diagram from mostly from the AS's perspective of what something, of what a grant request can go through during its life cycle. So either it's waiting to be approved or it has been approved and it can move back and forth between those states until eventually it gets to a state where you can't get anything, more out of it. All right, I'm going to go through each of these states and talk about kind of what they mean and how they move between each other. And this is a new section that is in the draft. And I do want to take a quick second to point out that we mentioned fancy diagrams. This actual diagram is actually in the draft as ASCII, or not as ASCII, as SVG. And that just makes me very happy that we can do that in RFCs now. Okay, next slide, please. So the processing state, this is where things go when you first make a request. It's also where things go sort of in between the other major states. So this means that the AS is trying to figure out what's going on. It's looking at the context of the request, all of the information that's come from the client instance, any information that's come from the end user and the resource owners and anybody else, and it's trying to figure out what do I need to do next. This is a transitive state in that you're not really meant to stay here for a long time, but while you're in this state, you're not issuing any tokens, you're not issuing any user information. You're trying to figure out what actually needs to happen. And if you need more information, you move to the pending state. So usually that means you need interaction from the end user. Sometimes it means you need to asynchronously go contact a resource owner. Sometimes it means you need more information from the client instance. And but in all of those cases, you're going to move to the pending state. If you are satisfied as the AS with everything that you've received for this request, so you've either already interacted or the client gave you enough information that you can just issue things right away, then you move to the approved state. And then if you get to a point where you just you realize that you can't process anymore, so you've exhausted your interaction capabilities, the client hasn't given you new information, or you're just in sort of an error state and you need to say like, yeah, this is done, I'm not giving you anything else, you move to the finalized state. We're going to step through those now. Next slide, please. So pending means that the AS needs more information. It has gone through its context and it has determined that it needs information from somewhere. This is the state that the request is in when you're waiting for the user to go log into the site and interact, or enter the user code, or get redirected, or use the app, or whatever other mechanisms that you're using during the interaction phase. The grant is basically sitting there waiting and pending, pending that interaction. It could also be waiting for the client instance to send its post-interaction follow-up message. So, when you're in this state and, the user is like checked all of the checkboxes and clicked the OK button, if there's an interaction finish message, then the AS sends that finish message out, but you're still sitting in the pending state until that finish message comes in and says that everything is approved or denied or whatever it is. And that importantly moves you back to the processing state. So you never go from pending directly to approved. The way this state diagram works is that you always flow back through the processing state because the AS needs to consider everything that it knows at that point of time to decide whether or not you might need more interaction. Or say you got one resource owner to sign off and you actually need 2 or 3 different ones to sign off. You could go from pending to processing to figure that out and straight back into pending, since you're waiting for more people to kind of show up and do their thing that may or may not be actually using the client. Let's see here. No modifications can be received when you're in this state. So the client can't send any updates to the request. It can't change what it's asking for. It can't, request new access tokens or anything like that. It's just, you're not issuing anything when you're in this state. And if during this state, by the way, this is a bit that wasn't called out in the text previously. It is actually possible for your interaction methods to time out, because you're not going to have a redirect that is just open forever. You're not going to have a user code that is just valid until the end of time. You're probably going to throw those away at some reasonable timeout. And if that happens and you're saying that like, no, this is completely canceled and I'm not doing anything like that, you can drop straight into the finalized state, which is a terminal state. Next slide, please.
Sorry to interrupt, guys. This is going to be quite a long presentation. So if you have any comments or questions, do jump in. Don't wait
Yes,
to
please.
the end.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yes. We should have noted that the editors kind of strung everything, strung all of our presentations together in one giant deck. So feel free to jump in at any point. Okay, so the approved state is when the AS has decided that it has everything that it needs and it can issue some access tokens or some subject information directly back to the client instance. When the in this state, the client can continue the it can request new access tokens based on the current state of the grant. So anything that's already been approved, the client can ask for additional access tokens to be issued during this state. Again, if the AS approves that, this is where that piece happens. The client can also modify the request, so either step up or step down, or a subset of access or something like that. It can send a modification request to the AS, at which point it moves back to processing, because now the AS has to figure out, what do I do with this new context of information? Do I need more information, so I go back into the pending state, or are they asking for a subset of everything, so I can just give them the new token or give them the new claim set and just go on with our day right from here? If the AS revokes the request or it times out or whatever the AS decides, this can also move directly into the finalized state from here. Next slide, please. And finally, no pun intended, the finalized state is a terminal state. This means that the grant is done and nothing more can happen. So when you're in this state, you are not issuing any new tokens. Anytime you get a modification or a continuation request, that is an error. And calling out this as a sort of a separate terminal state, we believe is actually going to be really helpful for developers, realizing that these aren't things that necessarily have to stick around, that you have to keep around forever. Once you decide, as the AS, once you decide that no more continuations can actually happen, nothing more can be gotten out of this grant request, then you finalize it and you're on your way. In OAuth, this is roughly equivalent to the refresh token being no good anymore, because you're no longer able to sort of make modifications in the context of that original request. If you need new tokens, if you need new subject information, you have to start again from the beginning, just like you would have to do an OAuth with a refresh token that's no longer good. Next slide, please, Aaron. All right, that is the grant life cycle. I want to pause for any questions on that life cycle discussion. If people want to know why it's there, what we're doing with it, what it means. No? All right, well, I will hand it back to Aaron for the next part of this presentation then.
Okay, so there's still a bunch of open issues on the draft. Some of them are planned that we're already planning on doing, is effectively accepted. The list of issues here that are spelled out are actually ones that at some point in the past we've actually put into the draft itself as references out to make sure that we don't forget to do them. There's a whole section that we want to do on key rotation for tokens, so that clients can actually not just have to use the same key over and over again. There's client management, and then there's a bunch of work to do in the resource server draft, mainly the idea of token models. And I think did we have slides on each of those? I'm trying to remember. Yes, we do. Okay. A couple of other related work that's going on is HTTP message signatures, which is not tied to any other particular layer. It's in the HTTP working group. What is the asterisk, Justin?
The HTTP working group is meeting this afternoon, and we will be asking for working group last call then.
Got it.
So, yeah.
So this week?
Today.
Today.
Okay.
Yeah, literally in a few hours, it's already in our slide deck that we're going to ask for working group last call. Because the editors of that spec, myself and Annabelle, believe that is ready to move to the next stage.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the message signatures draft. I think it opens up a lot of really cool possibilities, and it is one of the options available for signing things in Gnap. So that's why it's related. The signatures draft itself doesn't say anything about Gnap, obviously, or any other higher level protocol. It is just about HTTP message signing. So yeah, that's super cool. I'm very excited to see that progressing. Also related, security events, subject identifiers. So that, I don't remember when it went to last call, but the changes after last call are now in progress. And that is, remind me where we use that in Gnap, Justin.
So that's when you're getting back identifiers for the end user, and also so when you're like basically who's there right now, the AS can respond with it's this person identified by this email address or by this opaque identifier or by this subject issue outside of an assertion wrapper.
Right. Okay. So not necessarily related to security events, but as
Correct.
part of the integrated protocol. Okay, great.
Yep. I think this next bit is mine. Unless you wanna take
Yep,
this.
go for it.
All right. Okay. So not seeing anybody at the mic. All right. So key rotation has been a topic that has been brought up as a let's do this next for probably the last year. And the editors decided to finally sit down and figure out, you know, some concrete ideas on how we could actually do this. And so these slides represent sort of our early thinking of what this would actually look like in the context of Gnap. With the way that the protocol is structured, and especially with the clarity that that came from doing all of the state diagram, the state machine stuff, this last major revision, we realized that the major thing that we need to tackle is rotating keys specifically for tokens. So being able to say that for this particular token, I want to use a different key from the one that I did before. And if we're going to do that mechanically as part of the protocol, we need a way to prove possession of both the old key and the new key simultaneously. Now, initially, our naive thought was that, oh, we should be able to do this in kind of a universal way across all of the different key proofing types, at least all of the ones that we've thought of, and we realized kind of how dumb an idea that is, because they all present keys very, very differently, and who knows what else people are going to come up with for signing methods and key binding mechanisms. And I mean, we could see the revival of token binding in this space. Like, who knows? Like, we can't predict that. So our proposal is to actually allow different kinds of key presentation for each different proofing type in order to sort of fulfill a basic pattern to show that you possess both keys and can rotate it. And this would be, you know, part of an explicit part of the protocol that says I am rotating this key, and so look for this bit of information. So the pattern here is that you want to sign your message with the new key, and as part of that, you want to sign the new key with the old key value as part of that presentation. So this proves that you were in possession of the old key when you identified the new key. So that's you're taking your old key and signing the new key value. And at the same time, you're also in possession of the private key information of the new key so that you can sign that message of the old key with the new key to show that you have both of those at the same time. Next slide. And the basic idea is that there would be different ways to do this based on different proofing methods. So HTTP signatures is an interesting one because it, by design, allows multiple signatures on a single message, including the ability to sign a signature on the message. So you sign the message with the old key, and then you sign the message again, including the signature of the old key with the new key, and that fulfills that you know, that double signing function to prove that you have both keys at the same time. How exactly we signal this, you know, that's sort of a syntax and bike shedding discussion that we've got to figure out, and we've got to discuss as a working group, because you want to be able to say like, hey, I am signaling that I'm doing a new key here, and here's the information, and make sure that that's all tied together and all of that other stuff. This would be a field inside of the token rotation and the token management calls, by the way, since we're talking about changing keys for specific tokens. Next slide, please. With the Jose stuff, we can embed Jose objects within each other, right? So you can have a Jose format that allows the new key to actually be JWS signed with the old key value as a JWS payload. So you sign the outer message with the new key, and you sign the new key with the old key. That proves that you actually have both or held both at one point. This probably assumes a Jose flavored key format. Gnap technically doesn't make a strong connection between the key format and the signing method. So you can do HTTP signatures with certificates, or Jose with certificates, or signatures with jocks. Gnap itself doesn't actually care, but this rotation method kind of presumes a key format. That's something that we would need to discuss and figure out. This is something that could work though. Next slide. MTLS is definitely an interesting beast though, because you can obviously really only get away with presenting one client certificate at a time, at least as far as I'm aware. Yaron might be giving me a side eye at this point. He's off camera, I can't tell. But the thing is, with most MTLS deployments, you're actually already relying on external certificate management systems in PKI, or there's some other certificate negotiation thing. So rotation is mostly out of scope for an MTLS type thing. That said, Acme is doing some interesting work with client certificate attestation extensions. Kathleen Moriarty pointed us to this proposed work in Acme. So that's something we might be able to follow up with the Acme working group if there's something that they're working on that we can leverage to say, hey, if you need to do programmatic rotation with MTLS, go do this Acme thing, and this is how you present it as part of the protocol. Next slide, please. This raises some interesting questions. Specifically, if I have a token that's bound to, say, the detached Jose method, could I change that to use HTTP signatures with a different key? This means that it's that I'd be able to change out not only the key, but how it's getting presented. When we were looking at sort of the grand unified key rotation idea, which I mentioned we have since walked away from that idea. When we were looking at that, this was kind of in our mind of like, you're swapping out like this entire chunk of how I prove the key versus how versus like, and what the key itself actually is all at once. But the thing is, if we allow this, what does that combination actually look like? What would the syntax look like to change from Jose to HTTP sig? Like, are you using HTTP sig to sign a header of the Jose object, or because it's in the body, the Jose object is fine? And how do you do it in the other direction? Do you apply a signature and then put that into the payload of a Jose object? It gets weird really, really fast. And it also opens the question of somebody invents a new proofing method, which we expect that to happen. You know, what does that actually look like? What does that grid look like as that M by M grid of transformations happens? What does that look like? So the proposal is we actually just keep this fixed so that we can kind of avoid all of these questions and say, once you have a proofing method, you're sticking with that method, but you can change out the key. and we're going to require every method to define a way, including extensions, to define some way to manage key rotation, or say that key rotation is specifically not supported within the protocol. But you have to like declare that somehow. So that's our proposal for that. We would like feedback on this, and this is a discussion that we plan to bring to the list with a bit more of a write-up. Next slide, please. So this does bring up a related question that's been brought up a few times as a use case for Gnap. What if you want to use a different key for the access token than you when talking to the RS than what you use when talking to the AS? This is something that it seems a lot of people want to be able to do, at least in theory. But when you're separating these, it does raise some tough questions of, do we require that the client can use the RS facing key at the AS? Which means that the AS needs to be able to validate that key. And it might not always have the same ability to do so if the AS and RS are in different domains, and whatever reasoning you have for having a separate key for the RS as well. So that all needs to be considered. Technically, if you get into the syntax of Gnap, you could kind of do this now, but we don't actually say how to do this or what anybody is supposed to expect in this, in this circumstance. So this does need to be nailed down, and it feels like it's going to be very related to the whole key rotation thing, because you're presenting multiple keys at the same time and figuring out what to do with each of them. So this is a separate issue from key rotation, but we think it's all kind of going to be tied together. Speaking of, next slide. Client instance management is another thing that has come up. So if I dynamically show up with a client instance and say, here's my key, here's everything, I can get back, thanks Aaron, an instance identifier. OAuth has the dynamic client registration protocol, but also the separate dynamic client registration management protocol in a separate RFC. And in Gnap, we realized that we could actually have use a very similar pattern to what we're doing elsewhere in the protocol for grant continuation and the like, and just hand the client back a URI and a special access token to use at that URI to manage itself. And next slide, please. We just define a RESTful or REST-ish API for the client to change its properties, to rotate its keys using probably the same kinds of syntax as previously, and change its display name and homepage and all of that other stuff. Anything that would be associated with the client and that dynamic identifier could be done through this API. We've got all of the places that we need to hang it. We need to decide whether this is something that goes in the core, whether it's an extension, and whether this is something that people actually want to use. Next slide, please. All right, this is Fabien's part. So before we move on, any questions on the keys, the clients, any of those bits? Very quiet crowd today. Everybody's in the OAuth side meeting, I think. Or is that, no, wait, no, that's this afternoon. All right, go ahead, Fabien.
Hi, do you hear me?
Okay. It's a little bit. Can you say something else, Fabian? Because your audio is a little bit low.
It's a bit low. Okay, I'll try to speak louder. So yeah, the idea is to discuss about the token model. I'll need some hand also, just like Justin did, because I don't have access to the slides. So next, please. Aaron? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Yeah.
I don't know if the room can. So I'm not sure who was running slides for me.
Do you want to take the slide control, Fabian? I'm happy to press next slide for you if you want, but you can also take control.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I need a hand to actually change the slide, please. Hello?
Yes, Fabian, you're coming across. It's a little bit low, but it is coming across. So if you speak up and speak clearly, it'll probably work.
Yeah, Aaron will take care of the slide.
Can he hear us?
No. Fabian, can you actually hear us?
Yeah, Fabian, can you hear us?
Well, yes, thank you. If there's someone that could actually change the slide, because I don't have access to the slide deck. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, that's fine. So yeah, that part of the discussion is actually very open. It's actually because we've got some issues on the ERS draft. So the second part actually of the work we're doing. And issue 15, you've got the link into the slides, is actually discussing about a generic format, maybe as an appendix, maybe as something that's non-normative, that could be actually used for implementation guidance, so that we could actually relate to that when we're actually designing what we need in the access token. And we do think that it's a good idea. We are looking more for something like a token model instead of something like a token format itself. But we do think it makes sense. And the idea is to actually open the floor at the end to get your feedback on that. Next slide, please. So what we've got in the ERS draft today is a list of token formats that we have it's just an ID list for now. It's very unstable. It's as of today, and it's not written in stone, so it can change. But typically today we would have a registry that would contain some things like JOT signed, JOT encrypted, so that's fairly obvious. And then open the possibility to other types of formats, like macaroons and biscuits or Z-caps, which are actually providing different types of features. And we'll see that in a minute. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea that many other types of token formats exist, you've got a link to a podcast on the blog, which was done by fly.io. So it's not mine. It's just something as a reference to give you some ideas on other types of token formats. So obviously you get JOT inside them. You've got Paceto, which is, well, some people like it, some don't, and so on. And you've got macaroon and biscuits, which are described also in that document. And of course, it gets into more detail. But the idea is we're very used to using JOT. It's obviously everywhere. But in some cases, it's maybe not the best format. In some cases, you need other things. And it's not, what we'd like to do is to actually open the possibility for evolution, even in the Jose world. But then, of course, we need to check what's inside each type of format. And that's one also of the reasons for discussing token models instead of token formats. It's also to be able to guide in terms of information that's inserted into our token, but not mandate some specific implementations. Next slide, please. So what's the difference between a format and a model as we understand it? The token format is, well, in our case, it's typically JOT, but other formats exist, as we've seen. And the reasons why we want to accommodate various formats. So the first one, obviously, is evolutivity. And I've put at the end an appendix for Jose examples, for instance, new work items like JSON proofs and, well, a lot of other works which are related here. And also there are evolutions in the Jose world for post-quantum possibilities. So that's only beginning, but we see that this need for more going on in the space. And then we've got different use cases. So JOT is adding proofs, probably. And then you've got macaron and biscuits, which have a different way of working. So it's subtractive instead of additive. And for instance, you can implement things which are not available in JOTs, like attenuation capabilities. So an example is maybe I'm an administrator for a building. I actually give some biscuits or macarons to my employees, and then they can actually attenuate the token to just limit it to some part of the building that could be accessed by someone that's external to the building, that's external to the company. So that's the type of things you could do. It requires offline delegation in some parts. So it's really a complement to what we're doing with Gnap. So in some cases it can be useful, in some cases it's not. Obviously, JOT remains the main useful token, obviously, but it makes sense in some cases to not mandate a specific format. So a token model instead is really information that's typically shared by implementations, whatever they are. And so that's really the focus here. Next slide, please. So where should we describe the model? The first possibility in the core spec. So in the core spec, you've got the link here to Appendix C, which is on the component data models. And for instance, it's just a note right now. It's not written in a formal way. But for instance, we refer to be done to be described for the token. So the token has a resource owner, it has a user, a client, some resource list, a list of RS servers, etc. And we could probably detail the token model there. We could also provide a summary. The thing is, the core spec is already quite long. So it needs to be there only if it's really completely, well, if it's highly important in that specific spec. The second possibility, especially since the issue is actually on the RS draft itself, is that the RS draft might be a better placeholder. It's very open here. It's not completely clear. But it could be described here for the model as part of the context of the RS draft. And it might be a good way to actually have a link and the description between the model and the supported format, since in the RS draft, we already describe the ones which are supported. Of course, there's the question of how do we actually make the mapping to the explicit schema. I'm not really sure that it's meaningful to actually do that, but at least doing the exercise externally is important. We need to make sure it can be done. Next slide, please. So what's an access token value? That's important to have in mind. That's really what we use in the core spec. And as a reminder, the access token is really opaque to the client. So the client doesn't need to know what's inside the token itself. It just needs to actually be able to receive it and then send it to the resource server. And in the core spec, so you've got section 3.2.1 on the access token, where you do find a description on what's the value that's required at that point. And in the AS response, we also have a lot of information that's important. We have metadata on what the value means. So we've got a label, we've got associated rights, which is actually an array. We've got technical data as well, like key, some information on the expiry, the flags, managed URL, etc. So you do find a lot of information on the access token already in the API that's provided in the core spec. Next slide, please. So then you've got token introspection. So that's actually provided in the RS draft in section 3.3. And as a reminder, so that's already in the core spec, a token may be a bearer or it could be key bound. And the default is that it is key bound. And then in the RS draft, you do find some information on how to do token introspection. So the types of parameters that you're actually going to provide. So you've got access tokens, you've got the proof. So that's actually something that's recommended. The thing obviously is to be able to be very clear on whether you're in a bearer token mode or keybound mode, and that's why you've got flags in the core spec. And then you've got the resource server and you've got the access object. So that gives you an idea of what you need to do when you're actually introspecting the token, and that's the kind of interaction that you need to have in mind when you're designing that. Next slide, please. So the relevant documents now that we need to take into account. So there's a few. It's not an exhaustive list, but you've got the schema management for identity, which is interesting, where you do find a lot of information on the type of attributes that are available. Then you've got a new draft from Victorio, actually, on the JOT profile for overt access tokens, where you do find a header with the type parameter that's available in there. And then you've got claims. An interesting note here, I'm not entirely sure it's a good idea, but anyway, it's just a personal opinion here. You've got some new INR values for roles, groups, entitlements, etc. Well, these are actually the three that are available. And then you've got the JOT best current practice, and there's a section in there which is quite interesting for us, which is called JOT confusion, and the types of mitigations which are available, especially if you had a token which was generated in some context, like OAuth2, and then what would you do if it was actually sent over the wire to the Gnap service. So next slide, please. And now you do find the mitigations, which are actually provided in the previous document. So you've got 4 methods, and that shows you some important attributes. So of course, the issuer, the subject, that's something you need to validate. Same for the audience. And then there's some recommendation here on not just in the receive lane, like the keys that are available. So you need to actually make sure that you don't take that for granted. And then the last method, which is interesting for us, is to use explicit typing. And this might lead us to define something, at least for the JOT types of formats, to Gnap plus JOT as a proposal. So next slide. In terms of other relevant documents, even if we're not looking at the formats themselves, it's still interesting to make sure that the mapping is possible. So I've looked, for instance, at Pazeto, which makes claims on Jose methods and so on, but I don't want to get into that. It's just to make sure that other types of format would be possible in theory, at least. So they're actually providing they don't provide a type, they do provide a version, which is fairly equivalent to having 4 new Jose algorithms in some way. So there's a V3 and a V4, and you've got a local and a public type of algorithm, which supposedly is a solution for the alg methods, but actually you still need to trust the message to know which alg is used. So it doesn't really solve the main issue, since you can still change the algorithm. And you've got the purpose, which is similar to the audience. So an idea of audience makes sense, obviously. Then you've got the payload, and then you've got the footer. And the footer, interestingly, is mainly used for key rotation in that case. So it gets us back to the previous discussion on key rotation. Another example is biscuits. So here you've got only one cryptographic method. And you've got a data log engine, so it's actually a bit more advanced in terms of how you actually process claims. It's not just a schema, it's actually got an engine that's underlying. So you've got blocks, you've got base types, like you can have dates and a lot of different information there. And that's actually what gives you some additional capabilities, like for instance, you could have third-party blocks, which actually come from some external source that you can check, for instance. And then you do find unique identifiers, and especially for the revocation ID. So you do find something that's related to something that looks like GTY. Next slide, please. And so what's different in Gnap? So the main difference, obviously, is client ID from OAuth2 becomes client, and scope becomes access. So that's really the main difference. And so you do find on the right part of the screen what you've got typically in the OAuth world, like issuer, the subject, the audience. That's something that's fairly classical, that you would find pretty much everywhere. GTI is also something interesting. Not sure we should, if we want something that's completely generic, GTI in some implementation, it's really linked to JSON. In some cases, it's not the way you want to implement that from the previous examples. But anyway, that's the kind of thing you would find. Client is fairly obvious. It's just a name change between client ID and client, so it's very trivial. Access, obviously, you can embed that within your payload part, but it's kind of redundant because you've got that into the answer from the API in the response part. So it could be optional. It could, well, first it could be something we don't include or we don't mandate to include. It could be optional, or it could be something that we just pass by reference as well, just like we do for KID, for instance. And then we've got some other questions like sub. In our documents, sub IDs are referenced to a specific spec. So it's a bit more complex here. It would be meaningful, but only for opaque identifiers. So is it something we want to infer, or do we want to make sure that we can actually type the sub identifier? Can we, for instance, find there something that's a phone number or something else, or a date, maybe? And then we've got flags and key bounds. So we've discussed about KIDs, but that's the kind of things. Do we want to how do we want to actually deal with that? Same thing for expiry. Do we want to handle the expiry directly in the token or not? In many cases, it makes sense, but maybe not every time. And then the resource owner. In practice, it's often the same as the user, but maybe we need to support some specific cases which are discussed in section 4 of the main spec. Maybe that could be something where on top of the sub identifier, we might in some cases refer to resource owner. So it's just to give you some ideas. There's more on the mapping between OAuth2 and Gnap in the appendix D5 from the core spec, and I encourage you to actually have a look at that. Next slide, please. And then as a summary, in terms of header, probably a new type for Gnap makes sense, at least for JOT formats, but it's something to avoid cross protocol attacks that could be interesting. We've seen that we've got many claims that are useful in all cases, so issuers, sub, audience, GTI, and client, and others which could be used in some cases and which might be optional, or we'll have to see. So it was really to give you a broad summary of issue 15, which will be, I think, quite important, because having a format is quite critical. Next slide, and I think we get to the end. And that's the next steps. So here it was just a discussion, because it's something which will be important, especially for implementers. So next step is to actually submit a PR. We can actually expect that in the coming weeks. And the idea is to actually be able to review it publicly, and feedback is obviously welcome. And if you've got some ideas and feedbacks on that, we are quite keen to actually discuss it. So thanks very much, and I'll let the questions if there are some questions. And thanks, Aaron, for changing the slides.
All
right.
And that's it for the editor's slides. Although,
okay.
I did want to, unfortunately, I'm not down in Philadelphia, but somebody at Identiverse gave me the Gnap Smurf. So he will be coming to future IETF meetings when I'm here in person. And Aaron's promised that we're going to do a photo shoot with this guy so that he can live in all the slides going forward. So we didn't get a chance to get him into the presentation, so I wanted to make sure that he actually showed up at the meeting.
There has to be a Gnap. That's right.
Yeah, there has to be a Gnap Smurf from every meeting. Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all we had. I don't know if there was. I don't think there was anything else on the agenda. I saw a proposal, but I don't know what happened with that.
No, we did go through what we had scheduled, but and obviously, if there's anybody who wants to raise any issues or talk about anything in the presentation or that wasn't covered by the presentation, now is the time to step up to the mic. While we have you up there, if you would could you have some idea of the timeline ahead? I mean, what are we talking about in terms of iterations before we're getting close to our end goal here?
Yeah. So the way things have been progressing, a lot of what's been changing over the last, I want to say, 6 to 9 months or so, is that we've been, it's been a lot of removing sort of the more esoteric features, like, split token and the capabilities array and stuff like that. Stuff that seemed like it would have been a good idea, but nobody was building. And so we've been pulling that stuff back. And so a lot of what's been going in has been either cleanup of that or a lot of editorial discussion within the document itself. So things like the whole state machine discussion, like that entire section and the effects that it had on the rest of the draft, didn't actually change the protocol, but it changes the document significantly and sort of how people would approach the document. So this is a very roundabout way of saying that I think we've still got a few more of those. Oh, is my video not coming through?
Yep. You are.
Okay. You have mentioned in chat that video is getting clipped.
It's coming from
yeah. So so I would consider that the biggest things that we need to do in terms of functionality are sort of the key rotation stuff that we talked about in the core document, because that's something that's been brought up a lot, and including the key splitting between the AS and RS. So I would expect probably by the next IETF meeting, we'll have a draft that is fairly feature complete. And then from there, it's going to be the work to make sure that, the instructions for extensions are all in place. All of the IANA registration stuff is all in place, which does take time and text, but is less about changes in the protocol itself.
All right. It looked like we did have somebody in the queue for a. All right. Do you want to channel that? I'm in the room. All right. Well, perfect.
Yeah, so I guess to kind of, Mike Perek here. Good to see you, Justin, in this context, as opposed to over in other working groups. So, I guess kind of two questions. I mean, what is the end goal? I know the question was asked around that, but are we going after independent implementations, full interop, et cetera, all the way through, or just to get the protocol defined? Can you add some clarity there? And I have a kind of a follow-on for that as well. But
I'll let the chairs answer that, because that's more of a general IETF question than anything specific to Gnap.
Well, I mean, we are obviously looking we're looking to produce at least a couple of standards track RCs, right? That is kind of
right.
The technical output of this, right? Implementation-wise, that is typically a thing you kind of incorporate into the IETF process after like a BIS rotation. So the way this typically happens with IETF protocols is you publish your RFCs, you solicit the market response by sort of implementation and deployment. And then after a while, sometimes a year or two, sometimes longer, like the working group gets reconstituted, you go back, fix all of the bugs that the market has identified in the implementation, spin out a few bits versions of the same RFCs, and then you kind of have achieved a level of stability, right? That's kind of the arc of a typical.
Perfect. Yeah, no, helpful. I just wanted to kind of double check that, and then specifically in related to Gnap is, I guess this is probably a question for Aaron. Is like Okta planning on putting an implementation out once this is out, or where is that at?
Come back to this microphone. I am not aware of. I know Okta is keeping track of keeping track of the work going on, but I'm not aware of any current plans to go and immediately build it. That said, I'm also not the one that is on the actual product roadmap side of things, so I don't actually have that much insight into it. So I'm mostly participating in this as an individual here. Another Okta here.
Yeah, I'm on the product side, and we don't have any current plans to implement this at this stage.
Right. So I can say from my experience, I know of a couple of implementations that are out there in the wild, but they are in kind of siloed spaces. So this is part of Avast's verified.me platform, but they're using it within verified.me. They're not using it sort of to connect across to other implementations and things like that at this time. I know of a couple of companies over in sort of the fintech space that are using Gnap to do their authorization layer on things, and but again, they're building it within their ecosystems, and I haven't seen a lot of pull yet for sort of large scale provider or large scale N-by-M interop matrix type of testing. I can say that.
I will add that early on when we did the BOFN sort of planning out the work for Gnap, several of the large scale usual suspects with large access control deployments like AVS, they did say that the type of patterns that we've implemented in Gnap were quite common inside their domain. But as you say, they're inside. And
right.
So personally, I think we're like any protocol in this space, the arcs of deployment and testing and effect on the market is quite long. Typically,
yes,
it takes time.
Yeah, definitely for especially for a protocol like Gnap, where if you bolt on enough extras, you can do most of what's in Gnap with OAuth 2. It stops looking like OAuth 2 after a fairly short while, but you know, this is why we've put the effort into backporting rich authorization requests, and you know, the whole pushed authorization request concept is the same as Gnap's, you know, intent registration protocol. So we are definitely seeing the patterns, and at least the people that I'm talking to that have decided to go with Gnap have tried to. It's generally been they've tried to go do that stuff with OAuth, and then become frustrated with the sort of the cross product of extensions, and found Gnap as something that was designed for that cross product from the start, which was one of our goals going into this. Is, you know, as a design, how can we actually build this out as its own thing? So, I see Roman at the mic.
Yeah, Roman.
Hi, Roman Danilou, Carnegie Mellon University. I wanted to come up to the mic wearing no hat and with hat. So first, wearing the hat, I wanted to officially kind of follow up on the question about what are we doing with implementations. So this document in IETF parlance is in the proposed standard kind of status, which means that it in fact does not need an implementation to move forward to publication. So taking that hat off, as a kind of a personal individual participating group, I would strongly urge us to really think hard about doing a little bit of interop. This is a pretty big and complicated thing. We would tremendously benefit from trying to do some interop to make sure that we understand the edges here. Where we've seen working groups kind of do that, we end up with such a higher quality kind of product here. And while I appreciate that the arc of many things is put out the PS, get some adoption, kind of return to kind of fix, we could shorten with a little bit more investment, perhaps we could shorten the adoption curve by making sure that we have some at least reference implementation and some identification of interop. And then based on what we were talking about kind of here in the line, I'm really excited to hear that folks have adopted kind of the patterns and they have some of that early experience of what worked and didn't work, trying different technologies. I would love to see that brought here kind of as a presentation. So I guess, Justin, I know you mentioned it. If you had some contact with those organizations, please do invite them here. It would be phenomenal.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I mean, as you are aware, as everybody I think is aware, that there have been some initial interop efforts. I think last hackathon, Justin and Aaron did some work, and there's been some stuff happening there.
Yeah, I guess, and that's wonderful. Perhaps my finesse would be, let's bring that I guess experience of the hackathon formally into, for lack of a better term, the working group proceedings, to make sure that kind of everyone kind of benefits from that experience. You know, again, great that the running code is happening. We're learning from that. Let's actually just do a presentation or kind of wrap it up. So to make sure that, you know, what happens in the hackathon is in the proceedings, and we can kind of track things for us as a decision log.
And Adrian mentioned on chat that he wanted to raise some other issue. Please, Adrian, go right ahead.
So before we do, I just had one quick note,
Okay.
And that's that there is a pattern for interoperability and testing that I think that this group would really benefit from, and that's the type of testing harness that OpenID Foundation has made available for OpenID Connect and all of its extensions. The platform that's built on is not actually OAuth specific. I know because I wrote the platform, and the real question is, you know, where and how could we scrape up the time and funding and engineering expertise needed to take that platform and write a bunch of Gnap-based tests for it, so that people could throw their Gnap implementations against that. I would love to see that. I personally don't have the bandwidth to do it on my own, but I think that's something that the community would absolutely benefit from, and I'd love to see us try to do that.
Also, if going down that road, we're talking about sort of maintaining infrastructure for a long while. I think it actually makes sense to partner with something like the OID Foundation to talk about sort of how to have long-term sustainability and or something like that. And I agree, it is extremely useful.
Yep. All right, go ahead, Adrian.
Adrian. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention, in case it's worthy of some feedback in this forum, and I'll certainly raise it as an issue. I don't think it's going to be resolved in any sense today, that Gnap in its current form has a potential human rights issue. The problem, as you know, it's a delegation protocol. The problem with OAuth has been that it leads to platform oligopolies in the way it tends to be implemented. Gnap is primarily a delegation protocol, and that can be human rights affirming, which is very good. The problem is that Gnap does not allow, as I understand it, the resource owner to choose their authorization delegate. That poses privacy in the sense of data minimization, and choice in the sense of giving the resource owners market power problems that do have a human rights impact, and that is potentially bad. If my understanding of Gnap as it stands right now is correct, which it might not be. The mitigation to this problem is to allow the resource owner to choose their request processing agent. Right? This is the way we choose doctors or lawyers, for instance, as agents in order to mitigate a power asymmetry in our relationship to resource servers and users of clients and whatnot. Okay, so to mitigate this privacy and human rights consideration, Gnap should at least explain how it interacts with an agent of the resource owner. So to the extent that Gnap does not treat the AS as the request processing endpoint as being chosen by the resource owner, which I guess is fundamental to the design, at least the way Justin has explained it to me. There has to be at least an explanation, and maybe that explanation could be that we recommend using biscuits and macaroons as the authorization token formats, as was mentioned earlier, in order for there to be an agent of the user that can then process requests, or it could be that there are other mitigations to this issue that we want to discuss formally in the document. Thank you. That's my comment.
Hi, so yeah, I agree with the concerns, and I also sympathize with the how things have kind of turned out in the OAuth world. And what I think I'm more disappointed about is that I actually don't think it's a failing of the protocol. I think it's just what happens in the market, in the real world. And I think that even if there were things that like allowed or required that kind of behavior, I don't think it would play out differently. And one of the reasons I say this is because OpenID 1, old OpenID that doesn't really exist anymore, did exactly that, of allowing the user to choose where their authorization server is and basically forcing any relying party to accept arbitrary authorization servers, current terminology. And you can do that in OAuth. There's nothing stopping you from doing it, but in practice, nobody does it because the relying parties don't want to accept arbitrary user identities and authorization servers. And I don't think that that is necessarily something that can just be forced into a protocol, because as we've seen OpenID 1, it just stopped existing because it stopped getting used. So OpenID 2 doesn't, or OpenID Connect does not share the same goal of doing that. And while you still can implement it that way in OpenID Connect, nobody really has, because again, it's not the protocol's fault. So I don't know what the solution is, but I don't necessarily think that we're going to force that model in by changing changing the protocol.
So I'll take off my chair hat right now. I don't save time by not running down there. But even I think you're correct about that, right, Aaron? And that certainly is in line with my experience in the digital identity world, right? That people, relying parties, actually do want to control who they trust. But doesn't mean that a human rights consideration section that calls this out is not a good idea. Because the way I know that especially privacy advocates work today is that they work through consumer organizations. And what will happen if we have that kind of text is somebody might actually pick it up and try to use sort of that as leverage to pressure for sort of support for those kinds of models. And they might not succeed, right? But they will at least have a tool to work with. I think it's actually fair for us to give them that tool. Whether they succeed in using it is another story.
Justin?
Justin, please go next.
Yeah, so I completely agree with Leif. I think that makes a lot of sense. We have a privacy considerations discussion that does talk about ownership of the AS already a little bit, but that can be expanded in the direction that Adrian's been talking about. The other aspect that I think we need to keep considering is that from a design perspective, one of the things that Gnap brings to the table that was much more difficult in the OAuth world is the ability to sort of bring new information and different types of things to the AS as part of the protocol process. Whereas OAuth largely assumes, oh, I'm going to redirect you to a web page and then redirect you back. Gnap is much more open about kind of what happens in that stage. So if during that stage, the AS says, I need a set of verified credentials from your wallet that you need to present me here to do that. That's not solving the problem by separating the AS and the RS in the way that Adrian was talking about, but it is allowing the AS to accept external information that's not just this user is logging in and clicking the OK button. So that is a much more sort of system level approach to addressing the sort of the expansibility of the privacy and policy considerations here, beyond just forcing every RS to accept an arbitrary AS as its connection. Because I agree with Aaron that previous systems have tried to do that. UMA tried to do that. That was the part of UMA that nobody deployed.
Right. And a lot of other groups have tried that. Like Solid is one, for instance. But again, we can still sort of call the issue out. And and Adrian, I think it would be great if you would have time to put together some text, a few lines for the either privacy or even call it out as a human rights consideration section or something like that. But that's a detail. But having some sort of text, I think would be appreciated by I assume would be appreciated by the authors as a contribution.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm next on the queue. I will certainly do that. I am also reaching out to other groups in IETF to see if there's a community of interest that would like to address this issue explicitly in one way or another. My reply to Aaron's point, and Justin's and everybody else's, is that we are now given the discussions about the difficulty in regulating these oligopolies, these platforms, we are now in a very different regulatory capture type domain than we were when OAuth and UMA were being worked on. And what I'm seeing, at least, and I think many of you and some of the people in this meeting today, is that people are reaching for decentralization, are inventing decentralization protocols in W3C, for example, or DIF, in places that are not IETF, to fill in this gap that I think Gnap is, at least in my mind, supposed to fill. And how we fill it, obviously, I'm not the least bit able to say, but I will raise this issue with a PR to maybe the privacy consideration sections, it sounds like, and see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, I think this is last call for open mic issues. Going once, going twice. All right, we're done. We'll see you all in London, presumably. Safe trip home. So are we doing this now?
I think no, because
We're waiting, or we're waiting for Hans.